NC Pork. Good for the plate, great for the state.
The North Carolina Sports Network presents This Was Then. Exploring North Carolina's rich sports history with Tim Peeler and Todd McGee. Presented by NC Pork. Good for the plate, great for the state. Episode 4. A look back at the failed move of the Twins to the bold North State.
Welcome to This Was Then on the North Carolina Sports Network. I'm Todd McGee, and along with Tim Peeler, we're going back to the mid-1990s to look at a time when North Carolina was seemingly on the verge of landing a Major League Baseball team. Before we do that, it's barbecue season here in the bold North State, and that is a reminder that North Carolina pork isn't just delicious, it drives our economy with $10.4 billion in impact and 44,000 plus jobs. Pork is essential to the bold North State.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Peeler. Just wanted to take a little bit of time tonight and talk about North Carolina's history with professional baseball. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the 1900s. It includes minor league baseball teams. At one time, North Carolina had more minor league baseball teams than any other state in the country. It includes exhibition games with major league teams coming to North Carolina to play. The Philadelphia Phillies came here to Raleigh in 1911 and lost a game to NC State. NC State played several other games against National League teams as they came up through the South, headed up north after spring training to begin the baseball season. 1935, Babe Ruth played one of his last games as a professional here in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the place where, yes, he hit his first home run, but he also was struck out by a college baseball pitcher named Lefty Freeman. Those days go back many, many years, more than a century. Pro sports has gone through football and baseball and basketball, all here in the Carolinas. But the first chance that that the state of North Carolina had to have a Major League Baseball team was in the mid-1990s. And tonight, our two guests, Justin Catanoso and Jay Weiner, are going to tell us about those days when, believe it or not, the Minnesota Twins thought that playing in the warm climate of North Carolina just might be better than playing in the cold areas of Minnesota. And really what they thought was it would be better to have a new team in North Carolina than the one they had in Minnesota. So guys, thank you for joining us tonight. And let's talk a little bit about those days in the mid-1990s.
Go ahead, Justin, we'll start with you. Let me give you a brief introduction. Justin Catanoso is an author, university professor, and journalist based in Greensboro. His groundbreaking investigative series for the Greensboro News and Record on fraud in the tobacco industry earned a half dozen state and national reporting awards and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. After 13 years as founding executive editor of the Business Journal in Greensboro, he is now a professor of journalism at Wake Forest University and a freelance environmental journalist for the global news organization Manga Bay. So Justin, welcome to the show. And if you could just kind of tell us what was going on in the mid-1990s in Greensboro as far as trying to get a Major League Baseball team to come.
So just a little bit of business context. The Triad, I was a business reporter at that time at the News and Record in Greensboro. I had lived here for 6 or 7 years. And the Triad economy was bouncing back from a real hit to its manufacturing sector. And there was a young group of guys in their mid-30s that were baseball fans. They were involved with the Chamber of Commerce. They were a lawyer, an architect, real estate developer, and a banker. And they thought it'd be really neat if these single A baseball teams here in the Triad, Greensboro and Winston-Salem, if they could elevate themselves to double A or triple A. These four guys, it was Jim Phillips, Lowell Easter, Ken Mayer, and Tim Newman. These guys were friends of mine. Our kids were friends. They invited me to a meeting in Jim Phillips' backyard in the spring of 1995 to talk about bringing baseball to another level. Now, Tim Newman worked at Wachovia. He brings this idea back to Walter McDowell, who's the North Carolina president of Wachovia. And it also gets back to David Stonecipher, Jefferson Pilot, which is the Fortune 500 company in Greensboro. Both those guys say, why is shooting low? If we're going to shoot to elevate baseball in the Triad, let's go for Major League. And that's really where the idea started. And so in the entire summer of 1995, they started putting together a plan to raise the millions of dollars that were necessary. Tim Newman knew this guy named Don Beaver, who was an owner of several minor league baseball teams, a big baseball fan. He pitched in the Little League World Series in 1952. He agreed to sort of be the organizing guy around this effort. But in 1995, the plan was for the Triad to get ready for the next round of Major League expansion. They weren't looking to land a team that wanted to relocate because in 1995, there weren't any teams looking to relocate. It was all a plan about the future. They wanted to be ready by 98 or 99 to go forward with expansion and bring Major League Baseball to the center of North Carolina.
I'd just like to add in a little bit of other context. In 1987, Ron Shelton's movie called Bull Durham came out. It reignited the love of baseball in the state of North Carolina. Going back to 1980, when the Durham Bulls relocated back into downtown Durham, baseball was going through a renaissance in the state of North Carolina. Durham had just opened its gleaming new park after a year delay, the Durham Bulls Athletic Park in downtown Durham. It was getting great success. And as always has happened in North Carolina, between Charlotte's metropolitan area, the Triad in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and High Point, and Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, were all competing to see who could claim the stakes of the creating the most business opportunity for their area. And the Triad was certainly number 3 in those. But getting baseball to come to North Carolina would have elevated it to a much higher level.
And that was part of the goal. We were sort of the stepchild to Charlotte, to Raleigh, Durham, and the goal was if we are going to be major league, we being the Triad, then we needed to have a major league team. Now, Charlotte already had 2 teams. They had the Panthers and they had the Hornets in basketball. Raleigh was going to get hockey sooner or later, but baseball seemed like the thing that would fit the Triad because the price points were lower. It was in the center of the state. They just thought that they could be a good draw for the middle of the state. And the whole process sort of ramped up in intensity a year later when the Milwaukee Brewers were trying to put pressure on their state legislature for a new ballpark. And you can't have any leverage if there's nowhere to move. And when these guys that were putting together the Triad effort heard that Milwaukee might relocate if they couldn't get a stadium deal, suddenly that effort in the Triad got more serious. Don Beaver starts raising more money. They go to an all-star game in 1996 in Philadelphia. They meet Bud Selig, who's the acting commissioner of baseball at the time, also owner of the Brewers. And they take with them David Stonecipher, Jefferson Pilot, Walter McDowell, Wachovia, and they go, we are serious about bringing baseball to the Triad. There's just one problem, and that was Major League Baseball wasn't all that serious ever about the Triad, but this effort went forward anyway.
All right, so I just want to remind everybody that you're watching This Was Then on the North Carolina Sports Network. So we've kind of talked about how the effort started in Greensboro. So our next guest is going to talk a little bit about what was going on in Minnesota at the time. So Jay Weiner is a writer, speechwriter, editor, author, and communication consultant based in St. Paul, Minnesota. He spent more than 30 years in daily journalism, mostly at the Star Tribune of Minneapolis, and specialized in off-the-field sports issues. His book, Stadium Games, 50 Years of Big League Greed and Bush League Boondoggle, came out in 2000. His freelance work has appeared at ESPN.com, the Sports Journal, and the Washington Post. So, Jay, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Well, I can expand on Justin's story because after the Brewers were able to get their stadium financed, the Twins were the next ones in line. The Twin Cities in the state of Minnesota had been a poster child really for stadium finance debate. If people recall, in 1993, the hockey team, the North Stars, moved out of town. In the late 80s, a new basketball team came, an NBA expansion team, the same time that the Charlotte team came in, actually, in the NBA. But their owners hit hard times. They needed the public to buy their arena. The Vikings wanted a stadium, the NFL team. University of Minnesota wanted a new football stadium. And Carl Pohlad was at that point, maybe he's the owner of the Twins, second or third richest man in the state. And suddenly he wanted public funding as well. He first introduced the idea of a stadium in 1994. One of the Twins' problems, and the Vikings for that matter, was that the Metrodome, which was built in the late 70s, early 80s, opened in 1982, was at the end of the national stadium cycle of construction. So stadiums like Busch Stadium in St. Louis, Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati, Three Rivers, they were all built in the early 70s. And so those stadiums and those cities were beginning to think about new stadiums by the early 90s, really. Camden Yards, which was the jewel of new ballparks, that construction started in 1989, ended in 92, and the Twins ballpark was only 8 years old at that point. So their ability to ask for a new ballpark was going to be harder. It continued to be harder. And so by 1994, 95, 96, they went to various public bodies, the stadium commission that ran the Dome, the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, and they failed. Somewhere in this period when Don Beaver, who was actually a part owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates at that point too, and so knew people in the big leagues, when he emerges, frankly, and Justin knows this better than I, in the end became kind of a straw dog, I would say, for the Twins. That possibility emerges. He meets Pohlad, and the state of Minnesota, through the governor, as we go on through a couple of votes where the state house and Senate vote down the Twins, they decide to create what they called create a crisis. And that is, let's go out, find somebody who's going to buy these Twins, or so it seems, and let's make him this possibility that the Twins could move. And so we are, the context of the Twins seeking a new ballpark and the context of a Don Beaver existing allows Carl Pohlad and the supporters of a new ballpark to say, hey, if we don't do something, this team is going to move. And, Justin and I can talk more about all the permutations of how a team could actually move and where it would move. But that was the context of where the Twins stood.
North Carolina Pork is making a difference from family farms to your family table. With more than 46,000 jobs supported and $11 billion plus added to our economy, the pork industry plays a vital role in our communities. It's a legacy built on hard work, innovation, and a whole lot of flavor. From juicy chops to barbecue that brings people together, pork is more than a meal, it's a mission. North Carolina Pork, raising the bacon, raising the bar. To learn more, visit ncpork.org. Good for the plate, great for the state. From Friday night lights to championship moments, the North Carolina High School Athletic Association makes it all happen. Supporting student athletes across the state, the NCHSAA is the heart of high school sports in North Carolina. Learn more and get involved at nchsaa.org. That's nchsaa.org. The North Carolina High School Athletic Association, where champions are made.
So to me, it's fascinating that you talk about one of the great places in the country that has NFL football, NBA basketball, Major League Baseball, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, all the great things that Minneapolis and St. Paul have given to the U.S. And what we know about that city, I actually covered a game in the old Dome in 1986. NC State played a basketball game there in the NCAA tournament on an elevated court that looked like a stage, and people kept running off of it. So I remember that stadium well from the 80s. But going from there to Kernersville, that was a shock that everybody felt when they started talking about it, which is why I think in the major metropolitan areas, such as they were in the 1990s for North Carolina, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, and the Charlotte Metrolina area, never took the whole thing seriously. How can you move the Twins to Kernersville? Talk a little bit about that dynamic between the two locations, because it was stark and different.
Well, let me start here in North Carolina.
Go ahead,
It really comes down to the fact that this is a region, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and High Point. And it's only the collection of the region that makes it a metropolitan area with any kind of number. So it had over 1 million people in the metropolitan area. Greensboro and Winston-Salem are hyper competitive. They fought over the airport. They fought over their orchestras. They fought over everything. And there was no way that Greensboro was going to get support for a Major League Baseball team from Winston-Salem. Winston-Salem wasn't going to get support from Greensboro. So they had to put or talk about putting the thing in the middle of the region, with Arlington being the model. Arlington is between Dallas and Fort Worth, so that was the model. We're going to put a stadium in the middle. Unfortunately, it's in a town called Kernersville, which sounds a little bit like Mayberry. But that's why it had to go to a little town, because it needed to be in the middle of the metropolitan area, such as it is. But I need to emphasize, as Jay was saying, that they needed sort of a straw horse, and that's what the Triad ended up being. The folks in the Triad were dead serious about getting ready for this. Like, Don Beaver raised $75 million, which is a lot of money 30 years ago, in with people that wanted to be a part of his ownership group. They managed to get a referendum on the ballot to raise $140 million in tax money to go toward the stadium. They had the attention of Major League Baseball, even though Major League Baseball, given the choice in North Carolina, wanted to put that team in Charlotte. But these pesky, determined, earnest business people in the Triad, even though they were being mocked all around by the community and people outside the business community, they thought it was a joke. They kept pushing forward, and it really did play into Minnesota's hands in that sense, that it gave them somebody to play off of, because the North Carolina deal with Don Beaver was a real deal.
Justin, there were referenda in Forsyth and Guilford County that failed miserably. And
it did. And that's sort of the end of the story. So I don't know if we want to jump to the end, but yeah, the vote, we know that it didn't come here. The vote failed 2-1 because they didn't want to raise the tax. They pretty much, we have embraced our minor league status, but there was a whole lot of cool stuff going on that made great stories and great coverage for Jay and I before we got to that vote. Jay, where would you jump in?
Well, I was just going to say that the Kernersville idea and the market size was something that we in the Twin Cities, not because we thought we were superior to Kernersville, because we've got our own Kernersvilles here too, is that I covered all of those issues that I was telling you about: the North Stars moving, the Timberwolves coming in, their owners going under, the city of Minneapolis having to buy the arena, the Vikings wanting a stadium. And one of the questions that I learned to ask, particularly by the time the Twin situation came about, was how. So an owner says, I'm going to build a stadium on top of a former armaments camp that the Army had, and there's only one freeway that goes there, but that's where I want the stadium. And you say, that's really nice. I'm really happy for you, but how are you going to do that? There's no egress, there's no ingress. You got to clean the land, the whole deal. And so when we began to look at it, and I had a colleague helping named Steve Berg, who actually went to school in North Carolina, and he's the one who drove out to Kernersville the first time and came back and said, this is just silly talk. But then Justin and I were cooperating besides the fact he's a good reporter, and we became friends because the St. Paul newspaper, which was our competitor then, was part of the Knight Ridder chain. And so the Charlotte Observer and the St. Paul Pioneer Press could combine with their efforts. Justin and I were from independent newspapers. We found each other, and we began to work with each other. We began to share data about the size of the markets, the wealth of the market, the TV markets, et cetera. And it became very clear to us, again, the North Carolina people were earnest. The Minnesota people, though were known to be very nice, did understand that this just didn't feel right. It just didn't smell right. And I think that after a while, it became clear that the Twins and the governor of Minnesota understood that the general public understood that this really wasn't a serious threat. The issue between, let's say, baseball and football and an NFL team moving to a market like Charlotte, Nashville, et cetera, is that, well, Justin spoke about these 8 million people, I think it was, in this Triad area or in North Carolina. If it's 150 miles away on a Tuesday night, people do not get into their cars and go to a baseball game. On a given Sunday, they'll hop in their car for 8 times a year and go to a football game. But you need a concentrated market to support a baseball team that has to draw 2 million people a year, or it's not going to do well. So my perspective was that I was always skeptical, but Carl Pohlad was, an unpredictable guy at that point. And there was a lot of rah-rah, sis-boom-ba up here that we got to build a stadium for Carl because he's a good guy. And so we covered it. And now 30 years later, Justin and I think that we were taken advantage of. We enjoyed it at the time and had a lot of fun. But in the end, I think it was never going to happen. And we know that because it didn't happen.
Well, let me just add, there were really persuasive numbers, and it was why the editors said, Justin, like, this is the only story I covered for the better part of 3 years. The 8.3 million people within 150 miles of the Triad of Curtisville, 6.4 million people within 100 miles. 1.5 million was really the number to look at, and that was within 50 miles. But they kept harping on the 100-mile radius, which brought in the Raleigh-Durham metropolitan area, Charlotte, and Roanoke. And they talked about this, as the biggest available market on the East Coast between Washington or Baltimore and Atlanta. And all of that looked persuasive. And then when you looked at the people that were behind it, and keep in mind, the governor of North Carolina at the time was Jim Hunt. He came out in favor of this. He's like, North Carolina needs Major League Baseball, and the Triad needs a shot in the arm. I'm for this thing going to the Triad. So these numbers were persuasive, but I learned something from Jay. We traded off a lot of information, but he taught me some great reporting insight. And one of that was to look at the buying power. And when we looked at like the wealth in the Triad, it was nowhere. So something called the buying power index. The Triad was 47th in the country. Minnesota or Minneapolis was 13th. Effective buying power of the people that we had here, 169th in the country. Minnesota's in the top 20. Household income above 150,000, we were 57th. Again, Minneapolis, St. Paul, top 20. We just didn't have the wealth to support the very thing that we were going after. We may have had what looked like the population, but we didn't have the money. And we also didn't have the corporate base. We had fewer than a half a dozen Fortune 500 companies headquartered here. I mean, Jay, you've got at least a dozen or more in the Twin Cities.
16 or 17, depending on how you look at it, yeah.
And that's why there's Major League Baseball in Charlotte. It's all about selling seat licenses. It's all about selling luxury boxes. And the capacity for the Triad to do that was always going to be limited. But all of that was clouded by the enthusiasm and, quite frankly, the respect of those pushing this thing forward had in the general public.
Hey folks, David Glenn here. Game day just got easier thanks to NC by Train. Whether you're headed to Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, or Greensboro, skip the traffic and enjoy the ride. You get free Wi-Fi, comfy seats, and direct access to top sports towns, all at great prices. Learn more at ncbytrain.org and travel smarter to your next game. NC by Train. Go Connect. Michael Berard, Managing Director Investments with the Founders Group at Stifel, works with a select group of high net worth individuals and institutions to develop and implement investment plans tailored to their specific objectives and risk tolerances. If you are interested in highly personalized, well-researched guidance and outstanding personal service, you can contact Michael at 984-364-2002. That's 984-364-2002. Stifel Nicholas and Company Incorporated, member SIPC and NYSE.
I always like to say in baseball and all sports really, there are metrics, there is data, and there are statistics. And all of those can be manipulated into the way that you want them. So we now have things that I don't even know what they mean in terms of wins over replacement or OPS and things that current reporters love to tout and love to talk about. And they are all perfectly fine metrics, but they are not firm data or firm ways to emphasize the points you're trying to make. And I think this was an early of that.
But Tim, there's a big difference between WAR, whatever that stands for now in baseball, and RBIs and dollars and cents, and that's what what this came down to. I just want to add a footnote to this idea of the Arlington model of Dallas-Fort Worth. And now we're going back into Minnesota history. But in the mid 50s, when teams began to move, when the Boston Braves moved to Milwaukee, when the St. Louis Browns came from, but it became the Baltimore Orioles. Minneapolis, St. Paul wanted to do what the Triad wanted to do. So, they go backwards 40 years. And Minneapolis and St. Paul, in the same way that Winston-Salem competes with Greensboro and Raleigh with Durham, et cetera, they couldn't determine where to put their ballpark. So they put it in the suburbs also, in Bloomington, in between those two. So, it's back to the future that happens everywhere. But, before we leave also, and so I think we should get to the North Carolina referendum perhaps. But the other thing about this is the dollar amounts that we were talking about 30
years ago, Jack.
Yeah, it's coming up on 30 years ago, are nothing, are like an NBA 4-year deal for an off guard, $141 million to build a stadium, $75 million. What does Otani make per year? I don't know, but that's how much Don Beaver had raised. The Las Vegas team that used to be the Oakland A's, their new stadium is $1.8 billion, which leads to a whole other thing that baseball then said to Don Beaver, we don't want a team, if the Twins would move, playing for 2 years in a temporary minor league ballpark. We now this year have 2 major league teams playing in temporary minor league ballparks. And the other part about expansion, as Justin said, the North Carolina people wanted to do it back in 1995, 96. There hasn't been expansion in baseball since 1998. So they would be waiting a long time to get a team. And the only team that's really moved is in Las Vegas, which is significantly different from Kernersville.
Now, Justin, let's kind of wrap it up and talk about where we are now with Major League Baseball. So there is talk of expansion. There's nothing from Major League Baseball itself firm about that. You've got 2 teams in Florida, as Jay just mentioned, one playing in a minor league stadium that needs a new stadium after its stadium was damaged last year. The Miami Marlins, Florida Marlins, whatever they're called now. I saw a picture from a game the other day that had less than 5,000 people in it. So is either of those teams moving a possibility, and is that a greater likelihood than expansion? And where does North Carolina fit in that mix, the Greensboro, Charlotte, and Raleigh-Durham areas?
So you won't be surprised to hear that I'm not following this as closely as I used to. So what I know is what I've read in preparing for this podcast. I don't see any talk about moving these Florida teams. There is talk, though, about the current commissioner of baseball wanting to expand by 2 teams, getting the process going by the end of this century, by 2029, and adding teams by 2031. And, according to, again, the consensus, the leading contenders for this are not Charlotte. They're certainly not the Triad. The Triad will not be in this race for Major League Baseball 5 years from now. But the leading contenders are Salt Lake City and Nashville, which have 1 or 2 professional franchises now. It's really hard for a medium-sized city like Nashville and Salt Lake, compared to a New York or a Los Angeles, to support more than 2 or 3 teams. Minneapolis is an enormous market. It's one of only 12 cities in the country that has all 4 professional teams now, even though you lost some and you got some back. I think Charlotte, gets mentioned in that mix. Maybe Charlotte's big enough, to take on a baseball team, but Austin might be better positioned to do it. Nashville might be better positioned to do it. Salt Lake might be better positioned. Portland, that only has basketball, might be better positioned. It's just as Jake pointed out, the dollars are extraordinary. And unless there's a large corporate base there that's going to buy these luxury boxes and buy these seat licenses, which were pioneered in Charlotte's football stadium, never happened before. You had to spend a bunch of money that then obligated you to buy season tickets. It was crazy. But that's how they raised the money to build that stadium in Charlotte, and that became the way they raised public money thereafter to buy a lot of these other stadiums. The other thing that Jay and I learned about all this, and Jay knew this better than me, is the whole thing about the Triad was the economic impact this is going to have. It's going to create jobs, it's going to bring money, it's going to bring all this attention. All of that is nonsense. The economic impact of professional sports is nil. The teams get all that money, they pay it to the players, a couple of restaurants get some money, maybe a hotel, and that's about it. The jobs are seasonal. There's only 81 home games, or 365 days in a year. The rest of the time, that stadium's empty and nothing's happening in it. So you get these teams because you're proud of them and they bring you civic pride and they give you something to rally around if they win. I mean, but how do you think the Chicago White Sox feel these days, or the Colorado Rockies, which haven't even won 15 games yet?
You're such a naysayer, Justin. I don't know.
I love this story because I love the optimism. I love that these guys that were my friends and my peers were swinging for the fences, you know? And while I tried to keep the story in balance, I was pulling for them. Jay and I, we got some great trips out of this. We got to go to, baseball owners meetings in St. Pete and Phoenix. I got a trip to Minneapolis, and I got to meet Carl Pohlad. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, the right thing happened. We got beautiful minor league ballparks in downtown Winston-Salem and downtown Greensboro that are popular and thriving. And that's what we need. And major leagues, we're just going to have to drive to see that stuff here in the Triad.
All right, I'm going to wrap us all up by telling you one thing, and that is why Major League Baseball and the Minnesota Twins screwed up by not coming to Kernersville.
Let's hear it, Tim.
As far as I know, there's been exactly one native of Kernersville to make it to the major leagues. His name was Kemp Wicker. He played freshman baseball at NC State in 1927. He went through the minor leagues and made it to the majors with Yankees in 1936, 1937, and 1938. He took a couple of years off during the war, came back and played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He went to the World Series every single year that he played in his 4-year career. He won 2 World Series with the Yankees. He was a teammate of Lou Gehrig, obviously, and he was also one of the early people in the fight against ALS, the disease that we now know as Lou Gehrig's disease. They were very well connected to it. Kernersville had its own hero that could have been on the in a statue on the outside of the stadium to say the World Series comes to Kernersville because of what it could do, because its lone contribution had 4 World Series appearances in the 1930s and 1940s.
That was totally unconvincing, Tim. I'm sorry.
Usually my arguments are. You can ask my wife.
Okay.
Well, we really appreciate both of you, Justin and Jay, for taking time out of your schedule to kind of revisit this maybe forgotten chapter, perhaps maybe should be forgotten chapter in North Carolina sports history. And really appreciate y'all coming on with us.
Great. Thanks.
I enjoyed being here, and I enjoyed reading those old stories of mine and reading Jay's old stories. It was a lot of fun back then.
Yeah.